Hi, today we're going to talk a little bit about what mythology is and the beginning of the Trojan War. So, first, just to define what a myth is a traditional story with collective importance. So, there are two pieces to this definition. The first is traditional. We've already had the word trado tradere, which means to hand over. So, a tradition, remember, is something that is handed down from generation to generation, or sometimes just from person to person within a society. So, something that is passed along more organically rather than just sort of a top down, here's the story, and everyone takes this exact version of the story. If something is traditional, well, I might tell it to you, you tell it to someone else, they tell it to a couple of their friends, and it changes a little bit from person to person. There's an essential core to the story, the basic events, that's going to be more or less the same, but details might vary as different people tell it. So myths don't really have to be exactly the same, and they're not something that are evaluated exactly on truth. It's not something like how we use the word myth today to mean something that is false, something that you would want to evaluate in terms of whether or not is true or false, or just sort of think about as generally something to standardize. There's no one version of a myth. More on that in a minute. Then it also has collective importance. It has to be something that is in some way essential to the identity of the community or how they think of themselves that is handing this story around. So think about the stories we tend to tell about the American founding fathers, George Washington, Abraham Lincoln, those sorts of things. Those tell us a little bit more about how we think about ourselves as a country rather than just being, oh, here's a fun fact about George Washington or Abraham Lincoln. They have a deeper meaning to the people, even if they're not necessarily literally true, it still means something. We don't always believe that story about George Washington and the cherry tree, but it still means something regardless. Just here, this is a fun little bit. This is Odysseus actually listening to his own myth in a scene from the Odyssey. In ninth grade, you might get a little bit of this. He's crying. Here, his host Alcinous is realizing, he's not really liking this story too much. He's starting to catch on to the fact that Odysseus here might not be just some random stranger. This guy is the person telling the story, singing it. He's a bard, a poet who is functioning pretty much like Homer, if Homer existed, which, spoiler, probably not. But so if we just look at the types of myth quickly, well, the word mythos in Greek just means story. It's not something that, like I said before, has this innate truth characteristic. It doesn't need to be fully correct. And if I were telling stories about the gods or something, well, I'm just a puny little mortal. How would I know? It doesn't really need to be straight up truth. And that's one way in which is different from the way we think about modern religions. Our modern religions are based around the idea, well, many of them, of orthodoxy, that you think the particular right thing. And, to be a Christian, to be a Muslim, whatever, you need to believe this, 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 and this. And that's sort of the defining characteristic, what you believe to be true. Well, a myth, it's a story. It might be true, it might not, it might get to a deeper truth, but how are we to evaluate it? There might be many versions of it from town to town. So it doesn't need to be thought of in the same way. You're not going to go to your Wikipedia page for myth just like you would for whatever fandom you're interested in and say, oh, this happened, this was a continuity error, that director messed up, and sort of evaluate what's exactly true and what isn't. They can coexist. They don't need to be evaluated. You might have the same person use different conflicting versions of a myth depending on the point they want to make. So they're a lot more flexible, and in a way, their symbolic meaning is much more important than their literal meaning. Here we see Achilles. You can see him labeled in Greek. He's receiving a shield. This is Thetis, his mom. More on her shortly. So there are three types of myth in general. Like any typology, this isn't exact. You can find issues with it. What we're going to talk about actually is going to blur the distinction between divine and myths and legends. But in general, you can have divine myths where gods are the main characters, and these tend to explain a lot of things like why the world is the way it is, natural phenomena, why there are seasons, why we sacrifice to Zeus in a certain way, all this kind of stuff. Legends often have the gods involved. The gods will mess with people, set up some of the problems, or save them. But you kind of focus a little bit more on heroes, people who are a little bit greater than the rest of us. And then there are folk tales. Aesop's fables are kind of like this, where you could have animals as the characters that can teach like a little moral point, or you could have common people as your characters too. And these tend to follow like these really repetitive little patterns. Like if someone says, do not do this thing, no matter what, well, you know that that person is going to do the thing. Don't look in this box, don't open the box, don't ask this person this question. They're always going to do it. These are things called folktale motifs, and they're pretty predictable. And that's one of the ways you can identify folktales. We're going to be seeing a little bit more with divine myths and legends. Now, the Trojan War specifically, well, there are a lot of stories about it in this thing called the epic cycle. There were all of these poems that sort of coexisted and told bits of the Trojan War, which was this massive story. And this is almost like, think about like the Marvel Cinematic Universe, where you have all these movies and they tell bits of this larger story. And imagine that only a couple of them survived. That's kind of the situation we're in. We have the Iliad and the Odyssey. These two poems are attributed to this guy named Homer, who probably didn't exist. But they seem to have been the best of these poems. Some of the other ones were a little bit meh and didn't survive. But the Iliad and the Odyssey were basically the standard for Greek education. They were the cultural touchstones that every Greek would focus on, that were sort of the height of culture at that point. And these are passed down to us. And they're attributed to this Homer guy, but when we look at the details that ancient sources give, almost all that they can say about him is stuff that is kind of pulled from the poem, like he was writing himself into the story. That little scene where Odysseus is listening to the story of his own fight, well, that is one of the main sources, because there happens to be a blind poet named Demodocus, and the poet who is telling the Odyssey obviously treats him pretty well and is like, hey, everybody gave him a nice cut of the meat at the feast, all this sorts of stuff. Hint, hint, maybe you should give me some nice meat too. And while people are like, oh, he's putting himself into his own poem. Of course, it's autobiographical. Not really. So these two poems are pretty different, and they're not even written down until much, much later than they actually arose. They're part of a storytelling tradition, what we call an oral tradition, where you had these poets who would follow the main beats of the story, but probably improvise as they told the tales, and these would have been passed down from person to person. And at some point, they get set down. It's attributed to this Athenian tyrant named Pisistratus in the 6th century. But basically, you have a couple hundred years of these poems getting, well, seemingly better and better, because the Iliad and the Odyssey are amazing. And people work on them, pass them down, tell them to other people, and eventually they get fixed. And that's when we get our literary text of this. And because you always have to have a great genius of staggering intellect who created anything good, it can't just be something that was produced over time. It had to have been Homer. That's how the ancients think of it. It's taken a long time for people to get away from that idea, but there probably wasn't just one dude who made the whole thing. So the Iliad and the Odyssey, though, are both poems that just tell specific stories. The Iliad, which we're going to see a little bit of in our readings, is basically about 40 days in the war where Achilles kind of screws up. The Odyssey is about how Odysseus gets home after the war. The actual stuff that we hear about the fall of Troy with the Trojan horse and all that, well, there are multiple sources for it, but the main one is this much, much, much later, centuries later poem, not in Greek, but in Latin, by this guy named Virgil, who wrote under the first emperor, Augustus. And he actually wrote his poem very carefully, so it's very different than the kind of oral composition you get in the Iliad and the Odyssey. And, well, he's telling the story of Aeneas, who the Romans see as almost like their mythical ancestor. They're trying to find a way to connect themselves to this cool world of Greek mythology, write themselves into the story in a way. And So he tells about how Aeneas escapes from Troy with a bunch of survivors and eventually comes to Italy. And that's where we get a lot of the details about the fall of Troy, the Trojan horse, and all that, and the most full description of how that city is wiped out. So, then to go to just where the Trojan War started, this is going to be just the very beginning. We'll delve more into this later, but it's kind of the end of the heroic age for the Greeks. Some Greek historians will sort of start almost treat it as the beginning of the stuff they can actually talk about. Like if you have myths about Hercules wandering around the world and stuff, well, it's kind of hard to pin any of those details down. People tell these stories. Hercules has a lot of descendants, but how do you even begin to describe that? The Trojan War, though, starts kind of to seem like something you can talk about, kind of like the stuff that you see in their own contemporary time. And so it kind of forms this fuzzy boundary between mythological time, when you have heroes running around who are greater than everyone else, and more recognizable time, where people are and things are more like you would see every day. And so the Trojan War is when a lot of these heroes conveniently die off to make that transition happen. And the few that do survive, well, their descendants kind of peter out and stuff looks more and more normal. Um, Partly, this is the plan of Zeus. Zeus is a very clever god who has plans within plans within plans, because he has actually devoured the goddess of wisdom, Metis. Talk about that some other time. And, well, he kind of wants to get rid of all these heroes. There are various reasons you could put for this. One of the funniest ones is that the earth is sick of all these people stomping around on her. It's kind of uncomfortable. And so Zeus kind of wants to lower the human population a bit. Trojan War is a good way to do that. At any rate, this whole thing happens for so many causes, and you can never find just one cause. That cause is going to have a cause, is going to have a cause. But a good place to have it start is at the marriage of Peleus and Thetis. So Peleus is this mortal fellow who is a king, as far as humans go, pretty good. And Thetis is a minor nymph. She is a goddess, but not a particularly important one. Zeus is somewhat interested in her as he is not exactly faithful, but then he hears this prophecy rather, that she's going to have a son who will be greater than the father. Now, if you're the king of the gods, well, that sounds kind of scary, right? You don't want to take the risk that you're going to get anyone who could possibly depose you. So he's like, well, we need to get her out of the way, make sure this isn't a problem. So marry her to a mortal. If one mortal is better than another, well, who cares? They're all a bunch of puny humans. So they marry her to this dude, Peleus. She doesn't have much of a choice in the matter. She's not particularly happy about it, but at least she's going to have a kid that she likes, Achilles. Now, at this marriage, one thing you don't want at any old wedding is strife, people fighting. And so the goddess Eris, that's just the Greek for strife. Here you can see her in a little bit of a vase painting. She's got wings because she's scary. Well, she wasn't invited, but she takes offense at this, of course, and so she grabs this little golden apple, writes on it, to the fairest, to the prettiest, and she sort of tosses this into the middle of the wedding party from afar. And, well, Hera, Athena, and Aphrodite, if we're talking in terms of Roman names, these will be Juno, Minerva, and Venus. They each think, well, I'm the prettiest, I should get this. Zeus is the one they go to decide, well, who gets this golden apple? He's the king of the gods, but he's a bit of a coward, or you might say smart. He's just not going to even step in this mess. He's like, hey, ask that dude over there. Don't ask me. Have this guy, Paris, decide. Paris is this random human, a Trojan prince, who's actually in exile at the time. He's living like a shepherd because there's this prophecy about him too, that he's going to destroy his city. Well, they kicked him out for that reason, but that didn't really stop things. So the three goddesses go up to him and like, well, you should decide. And, like any sort of thing where you have to make a vote, make a choice, some people are going to try bribery. And each goddess promises something cool. Juno / Hera promises great power. She's the queen of the gods after all. Minerva, the or Athena, the goddess of wisdom, warfare, handicrafts, things like that, offers wisdom. But Aphrodite, of course, the goddess of love, not quite love, more desire, let's say, she promises the most beautiful woman in the world, Helen. Yeah, Helen's already married, though. You can guess which one Paris picks. He picks Helen. And so that's where the Trojan War is going to get started, because Paris is going to go eventually visit Sparta, where Helen lives, and there are various versions. She's abducted by him, or he seduces her, or even Aphrodite dupes him and makes a sort of image of her, a sort of likeness of her that he carries off to Troy. And the real Helen, oh, of course, she would never do anything wrong. She gets spirited away to Egypt, where the pharaoh just sort of keeps her like as a guest for 10 years. And when her husband Menelaus is eventually sailing back from the Trojan War, he's blown off course to Egypt, and he's like, Helen, you've been here all this time? More on all of this later, but that's the basic setup. So he is going to basically cause a huge diplomatic incident. And for reasons we will talk about soon, all the Greeks are going to have to go fight this war to get Helen back. Aphrodite, well, she's going to be on the Trojan side because, well, Paris chose her. She likes them now because he said she was the prettiest. Hera and Athena, well, a Trojan did not pick them. So, of course, they're going to hate all the Trojans. They're going to be on the Greek side, and they're going to be working to obliterate that city. How dare all the Trojans have offended them so greatly by having one of their exiled princes say that they weren't the prettiest. The Greek and Roman gods, as you see, are not exactly the nicest or the most sensible creatures. So, that's the setup for the Trojan War. In our readings, we're to the point where Achilles has sort of made a mess of things, and we will talk more about all of that soon.